welcome everyone, and thank you for being here, because 4:30 at the end of a long day, I'm sure you're also looking at the bar and the reception that starts at 6. So we'll try to make this as entertaining as possible for you. Really encourage your questions. This whole thing is going to be structured like a very much a discussion, and we want you to jump in anytime. So I'm going to do a quick introduction. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to talk about what they've been up to, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation here, and we'll welcome your questions and questions. Okay, so Joly is to my left. Joly, not like Angelina. CEO and founder of Overinteractive.
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 Yes.
Oh, not overactive.
Yes. Overinteractive
Entertainment. Recently won a Social TV Media Award for Best Social TV Drama Interaction for
the CBC's Heartland Ranch.
And launching a very cool new company called CineCoup that I'm hoping that you'll tell us a little bit more about. Francesca, this is the person you want to be really nice to and buy a drink for. She manages the English side of the CMF programs. So she manages $242 million worth of funding of the $370 million CMF fund. Matt DiPaolo.
I'm already feeling ganged up on.
We promised we'd behave. Okay, Matt's currently Senior Vice President and General Manager of Critical Mass with an office in Toronto, and I believe opening new offices internationally. He brings a wealth of experience from the agency side of marketing, having worked across PR, traditional digital, CRM, and media. On the content side, Matt's worked directly with content producers to produce original digital works for clients, as well as find ways through media for brands to fund IP across broadcast and digital channels. And Tina. Tina comes to us from San Francisco. Welcome. Tina's a user experience designer at Hot Studio, an experience design firm, as I said, in San Francisco. She's also one of the founders of Square Foot, a startup that connects retail and food entrepreneurs with idle spaces in blighted neighborhoods. Tina has a Bachelor of Science in Cognitive Psychology, which I think will probably come in handy in this line of work, and an MBA from University of Geneva. Welcome, Tina. And Alan.
And then there's Alan.
And then there's me. How to go this panel?
Alan is a seasoned executive with extensive cross-media deal-making experience. 10 years with NBC Universal, where he spearheaded a number of groundbreaking transmedia projects such as Battlestar Galactica Online, Red Faction, and the upcoming Defiance. Hardly a slouch. Alan's on his own. He recently launched a media advisory firm for global media companies in television, film, online video games, and emerging video platforms. So we've got a pretty diverse panel, pretty experienced panel, and diverse geographically as well. It's nice to have this kind of cross-section. So Jay, why don't you jump in and tell us a little bit about what you're up to and the kind of new digital models that you've been working with over the last few years.
Okay, I'll try and keep it brief. So 5 minutes.
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Very good. Okay, so my background. I've always worked in media, film and TV. I worked in film and TV for before I moved to Vancouver and became an entrepreneur for about 10 years. And a lot of what caused me to become an entrepreneur was an opportunity of knowing that. These, you can call them transmedia strategies, social media strategies, et cetera, and so forth, are going to become critical for linear media, i.e. film, TV, advertising, et cetera. And, I built my first company, Overinteractive, which many people know as Dime Rocker, which, we build really cool experiences for people like the CBC, Weinstein's. We're doing this really killer platform for TELUS to help millennials really get access to the funds around public access TV and stuff like that. Through working with the CBC on stuff like Kraft Hockeyville, Battle of the Blades, Heartland Ranch, and other clients, we started to realize there's a huge opportunity to potentially, we're going to start with film, but to disrupt the way film is marketed, basically packaged and financed. So we're going to be launching CineCoup, which is it's basically like a film accelerator. So if you guys can imagine, if you know what Y Combinator is, it's kind of like Y Combinator meets like American Idol, but it all takes place on the social web. So it's really gamified, and we're going to put up $1 million in financing and a guaranteed theatrical at Cineplex in Canada. So we're going to turn that machine on in December 1st is the launch, and we're going to be doing a 12-city tour across Canada ahead of that. And part of where we came to with that was realizing we have to turn filmmakers into entrepreneurs, and soon we're going to probably do one for TV pilots too. But where creatives like yourself really, in this day and age where we're really connected, multiple platforms, social, blah, 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 you've heard it all today, is if you start thinking like an entrepreneur, you can really leverage these very democratic platforms and channels to build lots of basically equity, and starting with realizing that audience is your equity. So I'll bring a little bit of my startup brain to it. So when you think about building something on, just say, you know, as this kind of whatever it is the experience or the creative story that you want to tell on these platforms, realize on the web that there's really only 3 ways you can scale a company to $100 million. And I know this kind of sounds weird, but if you actually apply it to a model where you want to be in the business part of it and make money, one, you have to kind of figure out a way where the lifetime value of your audience is actually 3 to 4 times more than the cost to acquire that audience, however you do that. The second way is to have a high viral coefficient, i.e. to really know how to maximize all those channels that could be social media, et cetera, and so forth. And the last one, which is the least kind of, that could be really applicable to you, but it's the one where the lifetime value of the actual audience is fairly low, but the way to get them is even lower. So you can use stuff like SEO and Facebook and so forth. So whenever you think about things, think about how can I get audience the fastest and the easiest and the cheapest if you don't have the money? Or B, how do I build a model around my content and in terms of how I'm going to push it out there that can basically attract a brand who can see the potential in that audience in terms of how you're going to scale it, how your business is going to work. So, you know, the entrepreneurial spirit and thinking like a startup is I think, key to the future for most of the people in this room. And with that, I'll turn it over to somebody who might be able to give you that first seed.
Thanks, Jay.
That was good. It was under 4 minutes.
Was it?
I think so.
Okay, so...
So first I have to do my disclaimer. So I work for Telefilm Canada, and we are the service provider for the Canada Media Fund. And if you really want to reach out to, you know, someone who has shaped the guidelines, Natalie Clermont sitting in the middle up there with her hand up. So, you know, in terms of a company that bravely has faced this kind of new digital world head on and really tried to be responsive, I'm proud to kind of be able to sit up here and talk about the company. So as you said, the Canada Media Fund is a $375 million fund, and we support convergent and experimental projects. So the convergent side, as you all know, has to have a television platform and a digital media platform, and then the experimental can have no film or television connections whatsoever, and that's really in the hopes that it can create support and kind of research and development and new technologies, new analytical tools, as Jay said. So that for us is kind of the hope to be kind of an incubator and really shake up and hopefully what I hope is disrupt a little bit of what's going on in the industry. So we're now 3 years in, and I'm completely gray, by the way, now. And what's been exciting is that there was such hesitation in the beginning. Everyone got really freaked out. I'm sure most of you are digital natives, and you're kind of pshawing all of the TV people, but the TV people really were nervous unless they came from the kids' world, which has been doing this for more than a decade. What's happening now is people are actually starting to catch on. I think what you've had today has been this great discussion about how you reach audiences, and I think that's the big part of why Heritage and the CMF have focused on distributing and creating content on different platforms. It's incredibly important, and what we want to support is that ability to take your story and let it migrate wherever the audience is. But one of the fundamental things, if I'll talk about strategies in terms of coming in for a selective fund, in particular the experimental stream, is you better know who your audience is. You better be able to tell us why your project is innovative and interactive enough to reach that, and how competitive you are. And I think in that way, we're also behaving a lot like the broadcasters nowadays. I think the broadcasters are buying into whatever your digital story is going to be, how is that going to reach the audiences for them? And if you don't, as Jeff said at the beginning, if you don't have that brand essence, and if you're not pitching that right from the beginning, I can tell you that, either the broadcaster's not necessarily going to have the money or resources to do the research to find that audience, or in some cases, maybe they'll take that IP away from you. That's not always a bad thing, because sometimes they can take and do really great things with it. But I think you have to be very specific and know your content and know who the right partner is. Sometimes we are absolutely the right partner. In terms of Convergent, I think between us and the Bell Fund and the Shaw Rocket Fund, and actually all the multitude of other funds, Canada is an incredible place to be when you're creating convergent content. I have spoken and been many places in the world, and people would like to marry all of you and come and live here, because when you sit there and say, oh yeah, I can go to the CMF and they'll give me 75% of my budget, they're like, huh? So but on the other side, and this is just me thinking, my biggest fear in terms of moving into that digital space is I don't want people to think that that is the only resource out there. That is what happened to the lovely television people. And when it starts evaporating and disintegrating, it's really hard. What you want to have is the entrepreneurial spirit. And you need to know, is your project better to go, is it more technological? And is it better to just go fast, speed to market, and find, a venture capitalist? Or is there a different type of accelerator fund that might work for you? Do you find a partner that maybe your digital content is going to work with their television? There's so many questions you have to ask. All of these things that we're probably going to talk about are big energy drains. To apply to our fund is a lot of work. Now, there can be a big payoff in the end, in all honesty, but it is a lot of work. And when you come to our fund, it is a partnership, and you should remember that it is a bureaucratic process. And I think that, for me, has been the biggest learning experience working with new clients. There's a lot of things we ask that you may not want to do, like financial audit reports per project, and creating single-purpose bank accounts, and getting E&O, and you kind of look at that list and you think, why am I doing this? And I look at you and say, I'm giving you $750,000. Of course you're going to do it, because we're going to be audited. Like, I am totally the bureaucrat here, because I'm all about audit proof, right? That's how I live my life. So if you can give me comfort that you're going to deliver, and that you're able to provide us with sometimes our really boring papers, your life is going to be great. But if you're not prepared to have that, and if you're not a business person, if you're creative, it's awesome. There is so much room in the world for being creative. But whenever I go and speak at universities, I say walk down the hall and find someone in the business program, find a lawyer, and then you're ready to go. Because if you don't have the big business acumen now, it's so challenging, and it takes you away from your creative time. And there's nothing worse than seeing a creative person have their energy zapped into a place where they don't have the skill set. So if you can kind of walk away with my one thing, is find someone who loves it. There are people out there, I know it's crazy, who actually love doing the business side, and they actually get their creative juices flowing. I'm kind of one of them, looking at budgets and financing, and oh my God, that's going to work, and we're going to finance it. So find those people, because they'll make your life easier. I think I kind of talked about what we wanted, but I'll keep interjecting.
Can you hear me okay? Is this mic working? Okay, great. Okay, so if there's a real entrepreneur in the room, they've written down that there's an opportunity for a dating site for American producers marrying single Canadians. Francesca, I want to ask you one thing, just out of curiosity. What's the split between funds for the experimental versus convergent streams, and do you see that changing down the road?
Right now, I'm looking now, 30,
just roughly.
35 million? 36 million. So it's 36 million that comes off comes off the top. Oh my God, I don't have my budget in front of me, right? It comes off the top. So it did start much smaller. It is growing incrementally. The one thing I will say is you do have to be aware that this is Heritage invests money, but so do the broadcaster distribution undertakings. So it's a big dance for our friends at the CMF to be able to keep carving money out that those BDUs like Rodgers and Cogeco and Shaw may not have a vested interest in. They should, because that's a great landscape to be playing in. But in terms of the convergent side, this year they did increase the convergent digital media incentive, which was spent within 3 months of being launched. And one of the criteria that I was really impressed about is they increased the budget. So you need to have a $100,000 digital budget to be able to be eligible. And for me, that's remarkable, because what the CMF is starting to do is coax everyone into a place where we start having much more money to actually tell that story on various other platforms. Because as you probably remember, when the CMF first launched, producers were scrambling and they were doing things off the side of the table. It was like, oh crap, okay, for our television development, we need to submit like the DM side. And that they took 5 seconds and just sort of said, well, of this kind of interactive website. And now what we're seeing is these incredibly robust plans that really are well thought out, that are definitely starting, as everyone's talked about, right at the beginning. So they create that story world, and they determine what is the best platform to be on, because I think that's critical. We don't interfere. Whatever platform you pick, that's great. But what we're starting to see is intelligent decisions, and producers starting to take ownership of where that should be instead of someone else imposing it. So the budgets have definitely increased, and the funding has been increasing over the years in terms of how much the broadcasters are also willing to allocate. So it's a positive trend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing we need to remember is that we've all been at this for about 5 minutes. These models are necessarily evolving because it's still pretty new. To begin with, VOD was an acceptable trigger for convergent funding. So a lot of people are talking about branded entertainment and whether or not working with a brand might be a way to replace that big infusion of cash that has come from traditional in the past. And Matt's had a lot of experience and has some definite opinions in this area. So Matt, tell us whether or not branded entertainment, content creators working with brands, is that the holy grail?
Well, I think they put me in the middle of the panel here to kind of deliver the blows early on so we can recoup later on afterwards. So I'll tell you a couple of stories of work that's been done to give you context. But I think the reality is, if you're looking for brand involvement, the chances of you getting directly to a brand or having a relationship directly with a brand is going to be really difficult for all of you. Most times, unless you've got a personal relationship with someone, they're going to tell you to go to talk to one of their agencies. I've worked at both creative agencies and media agencies, and I think for you guys, they are very different conversations to have with both of those. On the creative agency side, the creative agencies, they're ultimately paid for their ideas, their success and their kind of ongoing, their intellectual property, in their sense, is their ideas. They don't actually own any of their ideas because once the client pays them, the client retains ownership, but they really hold on to their ideas. So when an example of that, when I worked on the HP business at a previous agency, we got a brief in, and HP was launching this new part of their printers. It's called ePrint. The printers were going to be assigned, an email address, and they wanted a campaign to go out, and launch that, get people talking about that service. What we did then was came back with, we rented a studio down in New York. We hired Rob Riggle and the Upright Citizens Brigade, and we created this live stream event on YouTube where anyone in the world could tweet or send an email to this printer, And Rob Riggle would go over and pick up ideas off the printer, and the Upright Citizens Brigade would create sketches from those ideas coming from, crowdsourced from around the world. And that ran for a Friday afternoon. We had a band playing, kind of stole the SNL format, between comedy and bands. That was 100% driven by the creative agency coming up with the idea, but then they went out and hired and outsourced, getting producers and directors to, hired guns to actually pull it all together for them. On the media side, all they care about are the numbers. Think of media agencies, they are like financial planners or financial investors. They take a client's money and they need to invest in audiences. And much like the theme of today, talking about audiences equity, they are going to look for the most efficient reach and how can they reach the most people for the least amount of money. So when they're talking to you and they're talking for content ideas, there are media agencies out there, and where I was previously, they had something called Group M Entertainment, and that was part of the holding company. And Group M Entertainment functioned as an executive producer. They have money to greenlight productions, and they would look for IP that already had some level of an audience. So they would pull what the music did with the whole Justin Bieber things. Like, let's look for those YouTube shows. Let's look for that content that already has a bit of an audience. We can look at the YouTube stats, see how viable that is, and then we can invest in that to help take them to the next level and do a deal with a broadcaster. And so what happens is Group M, which is part of WPP, they have relationships with all the broadcasters, and then they own a bunch of media companies that actually rent the airtime. So Group M would do a deal with an executive producer. They would take some IP ownership in the idea, because they, if the idea got sold overseas, and they'd work with the producers on monetizing that. Then the media companies would get a discounted rate on renting the airtime for whatever programming, and they'd basically go to the broadcaster saying, okay, we're funding this production, we've got all the advertisers on board, we just need some airtime, make it happen. So, but ultimately those decisions were made on, is this a viable product that already has an audience, and can I make money on it? They weren't looking at anything that didn't already have a built-in audience. So I think for me, I think for all of you, when you're talking to those agencies, chances are, if you're going to talk to a creative agency, it's going to be a hired gun relationship. And you know what? You can get paid pretty well for doing money for creative agencies, and take that money and fund your projects on that way and still retain ownership. If you go to a media company, you better have an audience already that you've built over time, whether through YouTube or through other social channels, that you can use the media company to help you get to that next level.
What about having relationships directly with brands? Is that feasible? Have you seen much of that?
It's really tough for me, because much like every other industry, everyone's gotten leaner. So the people who on the brand side, the brand managers, their advertising and marketing is about this much of their job. They also got to handle distribution problems and operational issues and everything else. So they do a lot of times rely on their agencies to help kind of bring stuff forward that they should pay attention to. There are some rare brands out there, and P&G being probably the most obvious one. I think everyone knows P&G created the soap opera. They've always had a entertainment division, which has evolved from being a broadcast to more of a brand entertainment. They are probably more likely to have conversations, but most other brands aren't set up to kind of be in the content space. They will rely on their agencies to say, okay, here are my briefs, you tell me how to tackle those briefs.
What do you think about working with smaller brands? Like, we're talking about large brands like P&G that have agencies or multiple agencies. But what about working with smaller brands that maybe can't put up the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, but might be able to help fund something that's more experimental, maybe short webisode series?
Yeah, I think you can certainly, there's always the challenger brands in the market that are more likely to take some risk. I think, again, though, if you're going to try and have those conversations, it's going to be, what are they trying to achieve? It's very rare, again, that a brand is going to take a look at your idea and want to fund it, or want to just kind of participate in some product placement or whatnot. They're going to have a very specific need, and they're going to want whether that is a product launch or an issue or whatever, and they're going to want to bring storytellers and content people to help tell their story. So it is, I think, that's why if you've got a very specific IP you're trying to get funding for, the best way to do it is try and build your own audience and then take it to a media company.
So if I have an awesome idea, because I I got to look. According to the first panel, I've got about 8 more years working in the funding agency before it disappears. So, so I go out, I just bootstrap some kind of content. Do I have a brand in mind when I'm doing it? Like we were talking about Epic Mealtime, who just by chance kind of landed into this world of bacon, and it gave them great success. But what is that? Is it just saying, you know what, no, nothing's going to stop me. There are always going to be obstacles in the world, and as you say, I'm going to go do my job for pay, and I'm going to take, say, a percentage of that, and then just make the content? Like, does that work? Or do I go in saying, I really want to align myself with Red Bull, and they're my partner, and I start creating content that's going to excite them? Like, is there a good way or a bad way?
I mean, I think, is everyone familiar with Epic Mealtime? Everyone knows them. I think they are a great example because there's a group of people. They saw a website. thisiswhyyourefat.com, which had a big audience and a lot of viral effect. They decided to create an online series around This Is Why You're Fat. And again, they built this audience. They used YouTube and they, much like some of the previous examples mentioned earlier today, they engaged with their fans. They responded to comments. They responded to tweets. They did live events to build an audience. And then they looked at their analytics and they realized that every time they did an episode with the word bacon in it, their numbers were way higher than all the other episodes. So it's like, okay, we are going to own bacon, and they did. And they found ways. YouTube has some funding models where you can make money off advertising on your YouTube channel and whatnot, but they also sold merchandise to help fund it. And absolutely, as they started to own bacon, as they had a viable audience, then Maple Leaf and other brands would start to pay attention because now they're buying the audience, and it's an audience that's talking about bacon, and that's where they would never have had that. I'd not say never. I would highly doubt they would have had that conversation at the very beginning of it all, saying, hey, we're going to do this thing about This Is Why You're Fat, and we want to feature bacon. Do you want to be in? I don't know the concept.
Just say bacon.
I'm in.
Money.
Where's the check?
Okay, Tina, let's talk a little bit, because you're coming at this from Silicon Valley and those types of tech models that are very, very different than what many content producers in the room are used to.
Yeah, I'm going to essentially talk about a business model that I like to call FOMO for good. Does everyone here know what FOMO stands for? Fear of missing out. And San Francisco is essentially plagued by this. I think investors have a fear of missing out on investing on the next big thing. Entrepreneurs have a fear of missing out on being part of the next big thing. And hipsters especially are scared of missing out on the next big party. So I work for, or co-founded a project / company called Square Foot. And we connect retail and food entrepreneurs with idle spaces in blighted neighborhoods. And we learned a lot about pop-ups in this work. And so there's this little Chinese restaurant in the Mission District, which is kind of the hipster neighborhood. And it started by the chef named Danny Boyan. He had absolutely, no money. He was an entrepreneur chef, and he found this restaurant, kind of an unassuming Chinese restaurant, and used their kitchen and said, I'm going to pop up a restaurant here with only 4 tables, and I'm going to try out this new Szechuan cuisine. And the word got out, and there were lineups upon lineups for this place. And the lesson there is really that we want to create a perceived or a real scarcity of something. And that's how we can monetize digital. More and more digital is really becoming a commodity in many ways. Consumers are expecting digital things to be free now. I mean, ad-free, and you kind of wonder how consumers are expecting these products to be made. And there's a really great book called The Experience Economy by Pine and Gilmore. And they talk about a framework around, commodities, goods, services, and experiences, and how commodities are by definition very cheap, and the prices are sort of driven by the market. Whereas experiences, on the other extreme of things, is really unique to the consumer. It's limited, and so people are willing to pay premium prices for this kind of thing. So I think the talk earlier today by Trevor and ZTO was a really great example of this, of building an audience, using the digital platform and creating the story and engaging your users, and then creating a live performance that is sort of exclusive and short-lived, where you can charge potentially hundreds of dollars. There's also another really interesting project called Pop-Up Magazine, and they're doing a tour around the United States of journalists, writers, photographers from Wired Magazine, The New Yorker, and they essentially do a magazine live show for 90 minutes, and the thing sold out in 30 seconds when it went on sale. So these industries, and the music industry is another interesting example. Madonna charged $500 for her concert tickets most recently. So, these industries are really learning that you have to create that perceived or real scarcity of your product, and use digital as a way to build your audience.
There's an interesting model in town. Is anyone familiar with Music Fan One, Aaron Fish's new model? And it's similar to this, where very few people are allowed to come into a live concert experience. So in the real world, there's maybe 100 people watching a Lady Gaga concert. In the online world, people are able to come in, but they come in and walk through a virtual turnstile where they have to look at a product and provide information. It's not a lot, but some data to the brand that's sponsoring this whole thing. And I know MTV is looking at it right now, and it's exactly what you're speaking to. So that keep your eye out for that, because that could be a really nice homegrown success story. Alan and I were debating earlier today.
Debating is a nice way to say arguing. Throw down. Thank you for laughing. Just joking.
So, Alan, you've got some really definite ideas about funding models within each platform, and then talk us through again this overarching plan that you think we should be looking toward, and how they fit together.
Yeah, well, thank you. First, this is interesting for me because when we were at Banff, we had a really interesting conversation, because as an American kind of immersed in the traditional Hollywood world, you're right, I'd like to marry all of you, because the kind of money that is out there is just unbelievable. Whereas we're trying to protect Big Bird. You guys have, seriously, it's just absurd to me that, and most of the money for PBS, as you know, comes from private funding, and not from these kind of schemes. So I do think, and that's one of the things we were talking about, I do think that this space, whether you call it cross-media, transmedia, I think that Canada is such a fertile ground for it, and I think partly because of the funding, but also what I've seen is there's a real interest in pushing boundaries. And I think that I think this is the most exciting time in this space. I think where maybe I had a strong point of view earlier was I am very much of the view, having done this for a few years, and I think I'm going to repeat something that Jeff said earlier, Jeff Gomez said, and others, is I do think there's a distinction between marketing activities and true transmedia. And what I've seen, at least in the Hollywood kind of world, is people say, oh, well, we're going to do a transmedia play for this movie. Well, really, what are you going to do? Oh, we're going to have a second screen, or we're going to do a video game. That, to me, is not necessarily transmedia. And so really, one of the things that I take away from this when we talk about show me the money is ultimately, I think, you have to, as a producer, in terms of how you're going to manage your content and how you're going to get your content out there, I think you have to also focus on, is each platform as a standalone basis, is it a compelling, strong narrative? Is there a story that is kind of so fashioned and so immersed into this platform that on its own it would be a huge breakout hit, critically and most importantly financially. And I think that one of the advantages you have here in Canada is you're given the opportunity, there's a lot of forms to fill out. I'd fill out any form to get $750,000 to do one of these kind of projects because...
You haven't seen these applications, Alan.
Okay. Well,
They're very pretty. They're very pretty.
But I'm trained as a lawyer, so I kind of like all those things. But I actually think that when you're looking at this space, you have to think about it as a standalone property. You know, an example that I like to use is a project that I assume this is off the record, okay. I won't go into too many specifics, but there was a project that we were working on that did not happen. But the idea kind of sets it up pretty well. You know, for what I was doing most recently in the last few years, as well as what I hope to do the next years to come, is look at building great transformative experiences that you build from the ground up on day one. The example is we were working on a project where a very popular Canadian-based French language circus-type company that likes to do performances throughout Las Vegas was working with us and another television broadcaster and a gaming company. And what was important to all of us was that no matter what we did with it, whether it was the game, whether it was the comic book, whether it was the interesting theatrical performance in a round theater with various people flying around, it had to be kick-ass, pardon the language. It had to be standalone the best. And that whether, and so really one of the keys as we were working through that project is, you know, the game itself had to be a great game. Because although there's overlap between platforms, the gaming platform, people who are going to buy that game, people who want to spend $60 US on a new console game, they're going to want to have a high level of quality, and it has to be a great game. The show, when they show and they're paying $100 US minimum to go in to watch this big circus-like performance, they expect it to be of a certain quality. And so I guess where I'm going with this is that it's so important that each platform has to just be great. If it were just a great circus performance and there's a great website that you could go to, or there was a great kind of adjacent social, quasi-mediocre flash-based, game, that's not going to bring you money, and to me that's not really transmedia. So that's kind of what we were talking about. I think that we ultimately agreed, but what I would say is, in Canada in particular, you have an opportunity to really focus on building some great, interesting projects, and you've got an ability to create a laboratory through funding schemes that really no one else has, with the exception of maybe France and part of Asia. And I think I would just advise all kind of content producers to, obviously as others have said yesterday and then all morning, focus on story. It has to be a great story. Don't bootstrap a really great IP that is just a great movie and then you kind of bootstrap it to a game. That's never going to work. It has to be great for that platform. But it also has to be looked at from the standpoint of being a moneymaker. It has to be able to profit driver. It has to make money on that platform.
So, sorry, Matt, do you want to jump in?
I do, actually. Is that okay?
Please. Yes, please.
I think
Bring it on. Let's go.
No, I think you raise a really interesting point. I think one of the other examples we were talking about prior was another Canadian show called Bitchin' Kitchen, and great team out of Montreal. Again, built their presence online. Ended up getting TV show in Canada and in the U.S. But it's interesting when you talk about it being compelling in every place and how to monetize that. When you talk to them, the interesting thing for them is their end goal actually is monetizing merchandise that comes out of that brand. And I think they've been using the show as content to build an audience for that end goal. And I think there is a way to look at sometimes content as marketing to get that audience to build something else. But I do agree. I think one of the things I'm trying to personally champion for anyone else that's on Twitter right now that can help me do this, is I want people to stop referring to TV as the first screen. Because I think, thank you. I have friends here.
I'm going to be waiting. I'm watching.
But back, to build on your point about making sure things work in the right environment. For a lot of people in their living room, their tablet or their mobile device is their first screen, and the TV is background. And I think, and you're right, stuff has to work in the medium and use it appropriately and tell the right stories.
Yeah, no, I should be clear. I'm not in any way dismissing the value of what are essentially very effective adjacent marketing pieces to help drive the main property. I am not at all dismissing, not that you're saying that I am, but I think there's huge value in having one medium drive to another medium. QVC, a big popular channel in my country, is all about driving merchandise. I think that when we're talking about true transmedia storytelling, I think that we just have to be mindful of it going on to each of the different platforms.
Yeah. I was just going to say, so at what point do you cut bait? Because that's the other thing. You'll invest your time and your effort. Where do people go outside of, say, coming to one of us trying to sell an idea? How do you kind of get that sounding board? Because sometimes you get so you've invested so much time and effort, and working with a lot of creators, I know it becomes everything to you, and it goes a little to the entrepreneurial side of it, right? That at some point you have to let that idea go to move on to something else. Because I think for me is what I've seen is that people don't have the ability to let it go. And one of the things I love and I hate about Canada in terms of our funding is a lot of the automatic funding encourages that behavior, and it doesn't do what CineCoup does, which is make people be brave and take maybe more risk.
Yeah, no, people, you can't be precious with your ideas. You've got to learn to fail fast and fail hard. If you can get to that point in just kind of the way you look at what you're doing creatively, you'll be a lot happier. And that's even one of the things, and Fran and me have talked about it, that we're in such a high velocity state, like even the way the experimental fund runs, like in the time zones, really, if you look at angel investing, it should be smaller bits of money faster and people hitting milestones, because shit changes so fast these days. And I know that's a very difficult thing for you guys, and I know you guys want to probably kind of figure out a model like that. Like $25,000 can do a hell of a lot more damage in a month turnaround and a 30-day turnaround than $500,000 can 6 months later. Because your business could be irrelevant or someone else could beat you to the market. And it's only going to get faster. I think we talked about this morning. Like, we are, Moore's Law, we are going so fast right now, and stuff is getting like, the iPad Mini 2 will be probably 6 months away. It's just like it's driving people nuts in terms of that kind of thing.
I want to jump in here for a minute because I want to pick up. I'm sorry, Matt, but I want to pick up on something that Alan said. He talked about us having a great laboratory here, and there's the studio model where there's a development team. There are development teams in house, and they can play around. But what I'm really interested in, and what I'm hoping will resonate for a lot of people in the room, is what are the business models attached to development? Who pays for our sandbox as independents? Other than Francesca, because you do have a development component, but it also speaks to getting that money fast and being able to jump in and start building, start developing.
Yeah, well, I've always, my first money for both my businesses come from angel investors. It's having a great pitch and a great sense of what the business is, and again, how it scales. What's your burn rate? What are you going to need to achieve it? Do you have an exit strategy? Like these things, they might seem really boring, but you can actually, it costs about, just so you know, in time and effort to do a CMF grant, about $5,000 in even if it's sweat equity. That's just,
there's $1 million at the end sometimes.
No, but I'm just saying you can actually build a business plan that can probably, like for CineCoup, and this is no word of a lie, it was one slide with one investor. I got $25,000 over one beer. And that's the power of kind of being out in Vancouver, and maybe it's being on the West Coast. Beer's good.
But what was in the beer?
But literally, the best thing you can do is start looking around of people that kind of invest in that space. Their angel investors are great because they're high-risk investors. They have small bits of money they disperse really, really, really fast. Like those are little soldiers for them that go out and make more little soldiers and come back, and they just keep turning and turning and turning it.
But what did they take for that investment?
Well, they're going to take something, absolutely. We knew what our valuation was. We could defend our valuation, so we did $25,000 on $1 million valuation because I had a platform that we had invested more than $1 million on. So yeah, you have to take a haircut sometimes to get that cash. And you know what? Fast money in, take the haircut. Who cares? Yeah, you'll get diluted. It doesn't matter. You can get to market, and if you prove value, there's going to be a seed round and this and that. There's always a way to basically, it's better to take the money now than find that perfect, partner who's only going to take X amount. And I'm not saying give over the farm.
But Jay, to get to $1 million valuation, you're already down the development process. So for people that are starting out with just a clean idea that there's no way in hell you're going to get an angel to come in, it's very difficult. I've been down this path a lot as well. It's difficult to do, and they do take a lot at the early stage. What about, where else can we go when we have ideas? What are the other models to look towards to start developing?
There's been a lot of talk, I think, already about crowdsourcing. There's funds within YouTube and Google and that kind of world. I think again, to kind of build off the point of transmedia and thinking about things in different ways, the end point doesn't have to be a film or a TV. A starting point doesn't have to be a film or a TV show. And I think there's so many different ways to tell stories and so many different ways to use technology to do that you can start to go to. I'm familiar more with places in Toronto, maybe out here, but we've got places like Mars in Toronto. We've got Ryerson has the Digital Media Zone, which incubates companies. And you can start with something. You look at Angry Birds. That started as a game that's turned into a TV show and merchandise and movies and board games. But who would have thought of that at the time that they started with a game? And they failed a lot before they got to that game as well. And I think you got to look at how do you want to use different technology to tell stories, and then kind of go outside those access points of the traditional means to find ways to fund that.
Tina.
Yeah, and I think too the race to getting to market is a little bit of an illusion. It's more of a race to get to know your users. And there's so much lean startup techniques that you can apply to sort of get there. And interviewing people, doing your competitive analysis, or making paper prototypes and testing it with your audience is very cheap and very lean, and something that you can do tomorrow.
Yeah, just so you know, when I say market, I'm looking at audience like equity. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's not like a finished product or anything. It's the smallest thing you can put in front of an audience that starts getting you traction.
Absolutely.
Yeah, let me address. I think Tina's right, and I think the other key here is to the earlier question. What you said earlier about having a partner who is a trusted business advisor, a friend, and who can really say to you, because I think having seen a ton of pitches, some of these pitches are great, but they're not right for a film, or they're not right for a TV show. And I think you're right. I think that I'm not a creative, as you're about to see. The story will speak to you. The voice of where it's going to be the best way, where it's going to come alive, will be pretty obvious. If not to you, then to your trusted advisors, if they're really trusted. So I think it is important not to bite off more than you can chew. I also think, though, that in terms of getting out there, I think that YouTube, at least in the States, is a huge, huge, huge opportunity for you to experiment. And maybe it's not the YouTube platform itself. Maybe it's some other platform that we don't know the name of it yet. But I think basically what you need, and I know I'm overstating it, but you need an HD camera, and you need a point of view, and you need something that's unique and special. Doesn't mean that more than you and your mom are going to see it, but it gives you the opportunity to experiment and to kind of dabble. I'm going to contradict that 100%, though, by one point, which is, again, controversial. I do think that despite the fact that I love seeing cat videos on YouTube, and I despite the fact that there's room to engage with an audience from your original content, I have to tell you that you still need to think about brands. You still need to think about something that will be distinctive about what you're saying. I actually do think that to really break through in this amount of noise, there needs to be, although it's great to do original content, I do think there has to be something that ends up leveraging a brand or leveraging a point of view, something to break through. You've got to disrupt what's currently happening in the content space. And unfortunately for all of us, for all of you who create content, been there, done that. So you have to disrupt it in a unique and interesting way by a brand, by a different point of view, something.
Francesca, why don't you make the last comment and then we'll open it up for questions, okay?
I was just going to say what I find really unique that's going on right now are companies like Viral Spiral that look at, Charlie Bit My Finger. They approach, that family and they turn them into a brand, and they've gone off and they've actually made more money for, that family outside of YouTube. I mean, there is that kind of crazy Charlie Bit My Finger site, which is like, Charlie. But they're now going on to do this whole other TV series, based on that. So it can sometimes be those simple moments that galvanize, a system. I mean, you can look right. I mean, if I hear the Psy song one more time, because my children are obsessed with it, but he is now like everybody knows Samsung more because of him. He is like the person who isn't, promoting, Korea. So there are unique ways of doing it, and I think sometimes you can find unique partners. And as I said to you, having come from theater, what I always did is I took a look at what the story was and who did it connect with. So I did a story about Kindergarten, which was the most depressing thing, but I was like, oh, I think BMW might be interested in that. And it wasn't a lot of money, but they gave me money. So for me, I've always found that you have to be brazen. There are going to be a lot of no's, but you may be really interested in who says yes in the end.
Another company to check out is Be Active. I don't know how many of you know them. They're sort of taking it down piece by piece. They launched a drama on Pinterest and got some success with that, and then moved on to various platforms, and now they've released a feature film. We've got some time for questions, not a lot, but 5 minutes. Yes, is there a microphone?
So speaking in terms of monetization, do you feel that some platforms are naturally becoming loss leaders, or, as you said, is everything open for profit if it's done properly?
Sorry, and what do you mean by that?
Well, like television, for example, in the olden days of 5 years ago, if we're thinking of television in terms of the be-all and end-all, you're doing all the rest of this so you can get a broadcast license. Are we seeing a shift in the other way now where, because advertising revenues are dropping and things like that, you're using the television show to drive traffic to the My Little Pony action figures or something instead? Do you see any trends that you think are likely to become permanent, or is it simply a matter of doing every platform correctly to be profitable in all of them?
Well, I think it's everyone. I don't know any broadcaster that would allow something to be a loss leader on TV right now. I think you have to make money. There's huge revenue divisions at broadcasters. It's all driven by that. I think there is aspects. Absolutely, you can always have a loss leader, or and there might be a huge upfront user acquisition cost. Like, that's a lot of things people don't realize is you can't just put something out there and people show up. There is that virality that happens, but you can't actually. There's no such thing as when people come up to me and says, "Well, I'm going to do a viral video." It's like, there's no such thing as doing a viral video. You can't do that's like lightning in a bottle. But no, like one of the three ways, if you want to scale a company, there is ways to go out there, and it's called using inbound marketing and stuff like that. That you can do some really with a little bit of money. I don't think you have. I guess the thing is, I don't feel you should ever have to lose money because there's so many opportunities to make money.
I think it comes down to strategy, if I can just jump in here too. Yeah. I mean, certain channels at certain times can be used for one purpose, and at another time may actually be the revenue generator in and of itself. But it all comes down to having a strategy and making sure that all the pieces of the strategy support the whole. And again, we always talk about the sum being greater than the whole being greater than the sum of the parts.
What I would say, and I agree with everything that's being said. No one's ever going to encourage you to lose money on anything. However, you may, as you're negotiating and holding on to different rights for your IP, you may give up a little more for some things in order to hold on to some other things that have a bigger future value. So in the example I mentioned earlier, to get the TV show made, you may give up how much you could make because you're holding onto the merch rights because you think there's a bigger play there, but you still want to make money all the way through.
I was going to say that's the point. I'm a lost leader. The reason there is a Cars 2, is my understanding, is because it sold humongous merchandise, not because Cars 1 was a brilliant film. But did it lose money? No. It made a lot of money. But had it not also just driven huge revenue in terms of actual merch, then there probably wouldn't have been a Cars 2. So to the earlier point, I think they can feed each other. If I'm working on a transmedia project, of course I want to think about television and film. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. But if it does fit, I do want those because at a certain point, although I still want to make money on those individual platforms, they are huge drivers for the brand. They are 4-quadrant plays. So I like to include them in there because ultimately they'll drive the overall business. But I'm not going to be able to do anything if they're all losing money or any of them are losing money.
Do we have time for one more question? Is there another question?
Francesca, regarding the number you threw out, 100,000, is that inclusive of the funding contribution for a minimum of 100,000?
So that's the budget. So the budget size has to be a minimum of $100,000. And then in terms of, if it was, say, a $100,000 budget, the CMF could contribute up to 75%. In terms of this Convergent Digital Media Incentive, it didn't come from the broadcasters, so it was full access to that complete 75%. The broadcaster would have to give you 10%, and then you would. Traditionally, people would fill the gap with tax credits. In some cases, the broadcaster would actually fill it. In other cases, for larger budgets, I would say in that kind of $400,000 budget, we can sit with the Bell Fund or we could sit with the Shaw Fund. But where the CMF struggles is when it's those smaller budgets because we start to cannibalize each other because we cancel each other out.
Through you could steer me in the right direction as to what fund to go for?
Yes, if you come visit me, I'm happy to talk.
Okay, we've got to wrap it up. I want to thank each of you for being here, and thanks to all of you for
Thank
hanging
you,
until
Moyra.
the end.